You're listening to the AI Moment with me, Jonathan Wagstaffe.
And me, Denhard.
And today we're going to look at a report that's just been published by SmarterX, which is Paul Rutzer's company in the States. Now, a little background for those that don't know. So I've known about Paul for maybe 15 years. Paul was in digital marketing and ran a HubSpot partner. And I think I'm right in saying it was the first HubSpot partner, or one of the first HubSpot partners in the United States. Paul was one of the very first people I knew that really started to talk about AI. And I'm talking about 10 years ago now. And in fact, he went all in on it. I think he sold his digital agency and he set up SmarterX and went all in on AI. And for quite a few years, he was kind of like a voice in the wilderness. He and his team were going on about this AI stuff and the way it was all going to come, and particularly with respect to marketing, how it was going to work in marketing. And then along comes November 2022, ChatGPT is released, and suddenly everybody wants to know, and suddenly Paul finds that the world has caught up with him, and he's had a tremendous amount of success since then, helping organizations. One of the things that his team do is they publish an annual survey where they go out and survey people on the state of AI. And historically, that was marketers that they went to talk to. But more recently, it's become a general business. They announce it on their podcast. They announce it in all the other channels they've got. And this year, more than 2,100 professionals across all sorts of roles, all sorts of functions, all sorts of industries, all sorts of geographies responded to the survey between February and April of this year. And the results were out last week. Dan and I have both read it, and there's some really interesting things in there. I'd recommend anyone go read it. But we're going to talk today about some of the sort of main headline things that emerged from that report and our thoughts on them. Dan, what do you think? What was your first reaction to the report?
These sorts of reports are really important because not only do you get a pulse of what's happening, you also understand by quant and qual feedback, you understand what's the difference and the gap between people who are all in on something and people who haven't dived in as much, and the disconnection between the different audiences. So I think that was a really interesting deep dive, and something that reports like these are really important to understand and dive into. How do you want to kick this off? Do you want to go through some of the stats and findings, or do you want to give an overview of what you thought?
Yeah, no, let's look at it sort of subject by subject level. I think you're right. And I think one of the things that comes through with this report is, as we'll talk about, one or two of the findings are slightly surprising, given that this is an AI forward audience. You've got to assume that almost everybody who filled this thing in is interested in AI in some way. They're probably listening to AI podcasts. They're probably engaged with AI training organizations. They're probably using AI in some significant way in their professional role. And so some of the findings are interesting given that audience. I think one of the first areas to chat around is that there was this disconnect between, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something like 3/4 of the audience felt that AI would have a net negative effect on jobs going forward. But in lots of cases, they said, but my job's okay. I think only about 20% felt that their job was under threat, but they felt that jobs were under threat more generally from AI. I thought that was an interesting finding. And I think you and I have sort of, we've wavered on this. I think we're a little bit more optimistic maybe than the general populace, Dan, about the AI's ability to create jobs as well as destroy jobs. So, Anna, what was your take on that set of findings?
It was 71% expect AI to eliminate more jobs than it creates, and then only 20% worry about their own role. I think that is twofold. It's the audience that was surveyed and answered. I think that is something that we're seeing more and more, is people who are in management or leadership roles and understand AI believe that they're not at risk, whereas people maybe middle to more junior do feel like there's going to be their job at risk or jobs similar to theirs at risk. I do think there is a lack of appetite to retrain and reskill, especially in later career. So I do think there is going to be that real challenge around people who are probably going to feel like their job's going to be eliminated or be reduced or removed by AI. I see it the more businesses I talk to and the more peers I talk to, they do have a fear of at some point this year they're going to have to do a larger layoff than they'd even planned for because of AI or the pressure they're getting from AI. So I don't know whether it was a good or a bad thing that we got. We got this sort of 71%, but I do think there is a political and regulation process that we're probably going to have to think about and go through, away from just AI as an opportunity or AI is going to take jobs. I do think there is a bigger conversation to be had around it.
And I think there's some things we'll get to later around some of the observations around corporate behaviors that are making AI succeed or not. One of the things we've talked about, which I thought came through a little bit, was we've talked about the danger that we have where people just throw AI tools at people in the business and say, get on with it. And then they wonder why they get nowhere. I think we've still got this challenge of leaders are not creating or are not communicating a vision for the future of work. It's like, they're not standing up, being bold, maybe because they don't know, maybe because they're trying to work it out themselves, but they're not being bold and saying, right, this technology is here. It's going to change the world in these ways. By 2030, we're going to look like this, and this is how we're going to transition, and this is the plan. I'm not seeing much of that going on in many, many organizations. So then they wonder why they're not embedding or scaling AI. Well, it's because nobody's quite sure where they're trying to head with it. There's just, as you say, there are people playing with it. There are people frightened of it because it might take their job. There's not really this clear route to an end goal that the organization is trying to get to. And I think some of that reflects in some of those numbers that we saw there.
The question then, do you think that's a disconnect of understanding what AI is and where it's going? Or do you think that is we need the next 6 months to understand where LLMs and AI lands before we can make a long-term vision or long-term mission statement to get the teams behind it?
I think there's probably 2 or 3 bits to it. So I think despite best efforts of us and lots of other people, I think a lot of people are still not clear about where agentic sits and what exactly it can and can't do. So there's still a question around how far might this thing go and what can it and can't it do? How might it change the world? There's that going on. There's as I said earlier, there's the the inability or the unwillingness to paint a vision of the future by leaders to their teams, maybe because they don't know. But also we've got this thing, and again, I think this comes through in Rutz's report. There's a quote somewhere where he says something along the lines of, too many organizations are treating AI as a technical issue and they're giving it to IT and legal to deal with. But actually, IT and legal, their job is to reduce risk, not drive innovation transformation. Particularly in the enterprise space, therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that we're not getting these visionary views and these innovative initiatives with it, because actually the way it's set up at the moment isn't right. And for me, Dan, I mean, you may disagree, but for me, there's some real things to fix there in terms of awareness, in terms of leaders' willingness to articulate a vision. And as we've said so many times, this is not a tool rollout. This is not an IT project. This is a whole organization transformation project, and it's got to be driven like they're the kind of the thoughts I've had around it. I've not really come to a big conclusion yet. What about you?
I always say that you should think 5 years ahead, plan 3 years ahead, and act 1 year ahead. So you're never behind.
I like that.
So things will change.
I like that.
Things will change. So technology changes at a rip, right? It always accelerates. But one thing that you should have is a clear view and a clear articulation of where you need to go as a business. So whether that is tech-driven or whether that's something else. So yeah, it's a cultural change, but also you have to have a point of view and a goal and a North Star, if you like, North Stars as a business metric for people to follow. And in this world where AI is disrupting a lot of businesses, if you don't have a strong point of view of who you are, what you're doing, how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it by, some of your team will probably leave and go somewhere else. And I do think there's an underlining theme within this report, basically suggesting that the best ones, the people who understand it, do want the people around them and the leadership to guide them forward. That comes through in the report, isn't clearly called out, but I do think it is an important theme. I also believe that if you're struggling with AI, it shouldn't mean that you don't have a view of where you're going to be in 1 to 3 years. 5 years is probably a little optimistic for most businesses, but I do think you have to have a strong view of where you're going to be. So whether you're an IT company or whether you're in a coffee shop, you should plan out and go through the exercise of doing that. So my recommendation for businesses and business leaders would be try and get a grasp of the technology. You don't have to understand it top to bottom, but you should get a grasp of it and understand where your risks and benefits are and where you're likely to be disrupted. So whether you need to defend or attack it. And that's something in Strategy 101. So I do think there's there. And I do think you need to plan out and mark out the first, second and third order effects of it. So we have to go back to first principles. And as we've talked about before, applying a lean methodology, I do think you should be able to break down, understand the competitor landscape, understand what people are building outside your market, and give that. And AI will be a good co-pilot or assistant, not a brain. Don't just brainstorm with it because it's going to give you an average output. You have to give it real context and real insight. But if you're a leader, I think you do need to build and put together this plan that galvanizes change and empowers people in the right spots of your business and organization to help you understand it a little bit more or guide you in it. And if you're struggling, Jonathan and I excel in these sorts of things and love this, but there's a lot of this talk around transformation. There's a lot of talk around, 53% of individuals are integrating or part of transformation, but only 25% of orgs are at scaling. Size is one of the things that comes out in a report, and obviously shadow AI and power users and agents is an underlying theme there. If you get to understand those things, you'll be able to build somewhat of a rigorous plan for the next year. So I think these are all really important parts, which connects to the second part I really wanted to highlight was a couple of numbers out of the report. Was the top barriers to humans are lack of education, which is 38%, so you've got to get some training. Awareness, which is 35%, time was 30%, and fear and mistrust is 29%. These are all quite big human feelings and emotions around there, and a lot of it you can address and you can build towards. What did you find from that sort of finding, Jonathan? What's your take, and do you have some advice for our listeners on that?
I thought that was interesting. I'll come back to that in a second, but just to finish on the things you were talking about before that, this interesting observation, and you've kind of alluded to it, Dan. We've talked for a little while about we think this is the year when the gap starts to emerge. And there were the two findings we talked about at the top of the pod, which is 3/4 of the people believing that jobs will go, and 20% believe their job's in trouble. And the team, the SmarterX team have kicked around like, is this because people don't understand? Is this because people, some people think that they are the AI experts? What is it? And I think it's to do with, for me, it's that the people who are actually doing it are the AI experts. The people who believe that their jobs are safe are the ones who are actually using AI to work with their own job. And so they do believe they're safe, but it talks to this gap emerging we've talked about before between the haves and the have-nots, or whatever you want to say. So I think that's interesting. So your point about, the interesting observations around what's in the way, and it was to do with in early stage it's awareness, but as people get more advanced with the AI, then things like training and time become the things that are in the way. And some of those training requirements, when you look at the, what do people want more training on? Some of the biggest ones were like using agents, integrating tools into workflows, building no-code assistants. So the demand for training is really those people who are already engaged with AI, but now they want to get really advanced about it. The kind of lack of time becomes a big issue for people who are further up the curve as well, from what I see in the report. So somebody who's brand new with AI is not saying lack of time is my problem. They're having a little play with ChatGPT or something. But later, as they get more serious about it, people start to cite time as something that they're short of when they're trying to do this stuff. So, interesting that more in the enterprise space than anywhere, there is now training going on. But as Danny says, there's a lot of people still looking for help in here. You can't just throw people at this stuff and wonder why they don't get it. There's got to be the right implementation training programs. I spend a lot of time doing that kind of thing with people right now. It's good to see that enterprises are taking that more seriously. but there's still a lot of work still to do.
Yeah, I'd also say that if you want to future-proof it and move forward, you should probably start repointing some L&D, some land and development budget, and start reallocating it, not only to the training, but some of the tech changes. And that's something that really came to fruition for it. Was the smaller firms, how to report smaller firms all using ChatGPT, but the larger enterprises were, as we've jokingly said before, but also protected and defended Copilot. There are definitely these gaps and also these requirements to be a little bit more flexible and understand actually that the cost of AI is probably only going to go up, and you should budget accordingly. So whether you need to do it with your FD or CFO, or you proactively manage the company budget, I would suggest from this report and from what you and I have seen and experienced, there's definitely going to have to be an uptake and increase in L&D for it to be successful.
Yeah, there was like an extraordinary balance, wasn't there? That I think it's like, is it 73%? They said 73% of enterprises are using Copilot, over $1 billion revenue companies, and 73% of under $1 million, was it? Small businesses, 73% of them are using ChatGPT. So there's a very clear split, and that reflects exactly my experiences this year, Dan. That anywhere that's, I'd say, smaller than $1 billion, but anyone who's turning more than about 100 million in the UK is using Copilot, and it's an enterprise license. It's linked to their Office 365 or Azure rollout. It's all bundled in there, and that's how they do it. Everybody, everybody under 30 million in size, I'd say, is using ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, using one of those tools, one of the LLM tools, and doing more with it. And I think they said I think Claude and Gemini are both around about 40%, aren't they? They see use cases in about 40%. ChatGPT 73% in the small businesses, and Copilot 73% in the enterprises. So I think there's quite interesting symmetry about.
Yeah, and something that we haven't necessarily touched on for a little while that does bubble up to the surface from this report is shadow AI. So although they've rolled out Copilot or they use ChatGPT, there is this demand and there is this craving to use new tools, best-in-class tools. If you're trying to protect your business, I'd say that it'd be worth reviewing what tools people are actually using and where they're using it. Just because you've rolled out Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT, the likelihood is people are going off and using shadow AI and using the tools that make them better at their job.
Yeah, it was interesting. Back to the thing that people said they want more training education on. As I said earlier, it's some of the more complex subjects. Both tools and prompting surprised me in how small they now are. So only 15% of people said, I'd like more training on how you do prompting. Does that mean that everyone's moved beyond now? They know how to prompt, they're into the bigger world? No, but does it mean maybe this audience that's AI savvy is now better at prompting? Maybe it means that. So maybe the general population still needs help with prompting, but this AI savvy audience doesn't. And evaluating the tools and technology and vendors was also down around about 20%, I think, saying, I need help with that. So again, in my mind, it's like, well, does that mean that this AI aware audience now has worked that out and they know what they're doing with Claude and Gemini and everything else? But again, it's almost a shame. It would be great. You can't do this. It would be great if you could kind of force everybody to fill this in, and then you get a general population response, which was less AI savvy. So I think that kind of, where do you need help with training, is leaning towards the more complex things because it's an AI savvy audience. It's quite interesting to see.
I think a lot of them also probably believe that there's a bit of it's a tool now. So it's like another bit of software. So it's like email, it's like Excel or Google Sheets. It's like something else. So I think some people, when they read prompt or prompts, they probably are suggesting that they don't necessarily need it as much or need to train as much because they use it all the time and they just see it as a tool, versus where people who are less down the line of AI probably see it as and hear it as one of the most important elements. A very quick story. I've heard it numerous times. I heard it before Christmas and I've heard it a number of times since. There's startups that are getting more booth-based offices and they now have lapel mics, or they have mics that are in their booth and they're constantly just talking and whispering to the machines to give better and more detailed context to get better output. And not suggesting this is going to become normal behavior, but the savvy users are buying lapel mics. They are using headphone mics to give more information and context to get better results. And it didn't necessarily come through in this report, but I do think it's becoming slightly more culturally acceptable and more relevant in more likely startups. But people who are using it a lot are using voice a lot more.
Yeah, I think I happen to know a business called Cabin, run by a guy called Walter Craven, who are in the privacy booth, 1 and 2 person privacy booth business, and they're going gangbusters down. Probably for the reasons you talk about. So many organizations now installing those things in the business. I think he's doing a lot of work in the technology areas around King's Cross and also in the States. And also, I think you've seen places like airports where these things are starting to get installed as well. So I think, and that is probably to do with the more and more voice work being done, as you say, people using, or partly to do with the fact that people are using their voice for AI. I thought late in the report, there was some stuff around governance. I love the idea of AI governance. Governance was an interesting thing. And just to summarize, one of the things they talk about, I think Rotzer and the team at SmarterX real or recognize 4 pillars of governance. They talk about, have you got an AI council, i.e. some guiding body in your business? Is there a written down AI roadmap for the business? Do you have a generative AI policy? And do you have an AI ethics policy? And they say only 13% so far of organizations have all 4 of those. But those that do have all 4, they're making real progress with AI. And so I think one of the quotes in the report is the data reveals a strong correlation between governance infrastructure and organizational momentum. And I was looking at it and thinking, I would actually add a couple of things there. We've talked before about AI manifestos. So I would extend the AI policy to include a manifesto of a statement of what we're trying to do. And going back to what we said earlier, I would also add a clear CEO vision for the future of work in the business using AI. So I think their 4 governance documents are great. And I think I'd add a couple more to that, because those things all make it, that they make it much more realistic for a business to know what it's trying to do and then go and do it. And everybody align around the goal, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think?
Agree and disagree. I agree on that. The manifesto is probably your easiest and safest bet to create something that people can get behind. It's the guardrails. I believe most businesses need to understand where they're going, but I don't think they need to have a dedicated AI roadmap. And I don't think that because how businesses operate and I'd say I'm more medium to large businesses orientated. If you start creating bespoke or very specific roadmaps away from the main roadmap and you don't connect the goals together, you're going to get a lot of disconnect. And some people would choose the AI roadmap and only build and use AI. And then other people will ignore the existing roadmap. So I'd just be a little bit mindful and careful of that. Something that was in that report, which also made me laugh, was 32% had none. Had no, they didn't have the council roadmap policy or ethics policy. So that means there's an opportunity for people to build that and also build out the right one. So what would you recommend, Jonathan? Would it be the manifesto? Would it be the policy roadmap? And then maybe a year to 3 year vision?
I think there were 5 things at the end that were like the summary kind of points that they pulled together as a conclusion. And I think it was the first one was to close the readiness gap with the roadmap. So I agree with you, Danny. I don't think you should have lots of roadmaps around the place. I think there should be, like any business plan, there's an overall plan for where the business is going, and then there may be departmental plans that feed into that. So, if we're going to get here in 5 years' time, then marketing's got to achieve this and operations got to achieve that, and that's all going to feed into our overall plan. So it has to look like that. But I think one of the ways you close the gap between the haves and the have-nots is to be really, really clear about this is where we're going and this is the part AI is going to play. And you're going to need to be part of this story if you're going to work here 5 years from now. I think there was a stat somewhere else that said just about every business is saying, no, AI is going to be essential in the future. There's not many businesses out there saying, I think we'll get by without it. Just about everyone's agreed it's important. And I think so that having a roadmap like that, which is tied to a CEO that communicates it, one of the other things they talk about is don't mistake CEO's enthusiasm for organizational readiness to the point you made earlier, CEOs are saying, yeah, we're ready and we're at this point and we're moving forward, and the organization seems to be lagging behind them. And so, that's got to all be, that all fixes with a roadmap as well. So CEO's got a clear view, communicates the view clearly, future of work statement, readiness gap is closed then with a roadmap. Then you can look at a couple of things that are in the way. One is training, as we talked about earlier. So then go and design the training for where your people actually are. You've got to meet them where they are to bring them along. And also you've got to fix some of the AI sentiment things, which we've not really touched on, but again is in the report, that, half the people surveyed are not at all sure about the future of AI and whether it's a good or bad thing and all that. Now that's in an AI forward audience. That's a really remarkable step. Those of us who are out there, flying the flag for AI and trying to work out how it all works, and we're trying to feel our way through the wilderness to what happens next. Half of us aren't sure it's a good idea. Then you can bet your pants, a lot of people back there are already skeptical. They're not going to think. So we've got to take that seriously and work out what we do about it. And then the final bit is the governance we talked about. We need to be building governance in as we go from here. So that would be my conclusion. And some of that is directly related to what's in the sort of conclusion of the report, but it strikes me as a good way to take it forward.
I agree. I think there's a lot in there, and there's a hell of a lot in there that if you're on your journey but you're not yet confident, I do think this will open a couple of doors for you and probably turn some light switches on where you can feel a bit more empowered to make some changes and make some adjustments to where you're at and understand where your company's at. I always recommend running an internal survey. So whether it's like an EMPS or more quant and qual feedback, a really simple Google form or Microsoft form with, say, 5 to 10 questions will give you so much more insight. I know some companies hate filling out forms, but I do think with something that's as divisive as AI is a really powerful way to gather information and then take action on that information, and then be informed when you're starting putting together your 12-month roadmap, or you revisit your annual planning cycle. Typically is around now until July. So I highly recommend that you do have a look through it. You consider writing a form with some feedback and understanding that actually, even if you are early on your journey, there's so much that you can benefit from by these style of reports, and take confidence that people who are highly, highly confident in AI aren't as confident with some of the future. So there are a few key takeaways. We'll link it and embed it in the newsletter so people can download it straight from there. We'll put it in the show notes as well. And maybe we'll give a couple of top level highlights in there so you can take that forward and have a look through really specific parts yourself.
Yeah, my final comments will be that one of the interesting things, the biggest struggle was one of the questions, and lots of people are saying keeping up with the pace of change is a big struggle for them. And I would echo that. And I don't know how we fix that, Dan. All the things we talked about this morning, if people can't even keep up with the pace of change, then they become a lot harder. So I don't think none of the vendors are going to slow down. Everything I'm reading and seeing says they're accelerating. We think we've been through extraordinary change in the first 5 months of this year. We have, but guess what? It's going to accelerate. But the other thing I took away, I thought later when I read the report and digested it, still a lot of the opportunity is seen in productivity and efficiency. People are talking about productivity and efficiency. And I didn't see as much talk of transformative capability. So my overall conclusion was there's tremendous stuff in this report, but maybe people still aren't thinking big enough about what this technology is going to do for us, the innovation, the transformation it might bring. That was my kind of overall thing at the end, is that there's a lot of really good things. There's a lot of information in here about what people are doing right now, but people still need to think bigger about what this technology could bring for us. That was my kind of final thought.
I agree.
Good. We talked a little bit longer there than we normally do on the pod, but I think it's been worth it. I think it was a nice piece of work really worth the discussion. So good to see you, my friend, and I will see you next time.
Thanks for listening today, everyone. If you liked what you heard, please give us a rating and review in any of the podcast players. We have a supporting newsletter, which is aimoment.co.uk, that comes out on Mondays and Fridays with every pod, and we dive a little bit deeper. So please subscribe there. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.